This book is a book about it reads like a sci-fi thriller, but it's a real lived experience that we all had in LA as Angelinos, and I think that everyone will experience at some point soon. It's a book about people as much as it is about politics and as it is about the climate. And I just think of all the people that I met. I needed this book so badly for myself because it was such a traumatizing thing that I think I probably still have some form of, if not diagnosable PTSD. Like this was a collective trauma that we
Yeah.
all experienced together.
Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening? With me, your host, Chris Hayes. It was only a year ago that Los Angeles was devastated by some of the worst wildfires in recent recorded history. It feels like another era. It feels like I can't believe it was only a year ago, but there was a lot about it that has stuck with me. Partly it was kind of the first introduction to the Trump second term, even though he wasn't yet president, because he was the incoming president. Everybody was in a kind of state of shock and depression and stupor. I mean, people that aren't big Donald Trump fans. And he was just unfathomably gross and reckless about it, and all of the traits that we've come to expect in him and seen under a crisis, making up lies, blaming people, berating people, not doing anything helpful, looking to sort of distance himself from blame. It's also a climate event in a time when we have an administration that is dead set on accelerating and worsening the climate crisis, cutting money to mitigate the climate crisis, trying to basically subsidize coal so that we burn more of it. And also it's just a profoundly intense, wrenching human tragedy. I learned a lot about a bunch of different communities in Los Angeles I'd never learned about. I learned a lot about the geography and the sort of weather conditions and about the heroism of the people that tried to fight it. And it was a sort of incredible moment and came and went. And like so many things that we cover in the news, the news cycle moves so fast that you move on to the next thing and you're left with a bunch of unresolved questions and storylines and things that you want to know. And so I was so excited to get my hands a few weeks ago on the new New York Times bestselling book, Firestorm: The Great Los Angeles Fire and America's New Age of Disaster, by my good friend and colleague, Jacob Soboroff. He is the MS Now senior political and national reporter. You may have seen him reporting on these fires on my show and on many of the shows of MS Now. His first book, Separated, is an incredible piece of work. It was turned into a remarkable film. Jacob is one of my favorite reporters, one of the best people in the news business, and it's a great pleasure to have him on Why Is This Happening?
Chris, thank you so much for having me, man. As they say in radio, long-time listener, first-time caller to the pod.
Yeah, that's right. I was just thinking as I was having you on. So just first situate us, because this, part of what makes the book is great, by the way. I really tore
Thank
through
you.
it. It's a really great
Thanks.
read. And part of what gives it such intense life is that this is like your home. Like this is as close to you. It's a very personal story. Tell me about where you grew up, where your family is, and how close this all was to you.
Before I even do that, I was just thinking to myself how crazy it is. And I don't know if it's the your time slot or whatever. It seems like every major national story that I end up covering for MS, it always starts on your show. Family separation started on your show. And we had that lengthy discussion as I walked outside that detention center. And I think the first live report I did about this on MS was on your broadcast. And I remember calling into the control room and telling Tina Cohn, like, this is big. This is really big. A lot of times, like, you got to go through the quote unquote desk and the assignment people and the show bookers and all this stuff. And I just called and I said, you guys don't understand. This is a once in a lifetime event that's happening in LA right now. And I always am, but particularly grateful to you and your whole team on All In for putting me on, because the Palisades, to answer your question, is my home. It was my home until I was 18. And it is the most amazing coastal enclave, situated between Santa Monica and Malibu on the Pacific coast. And every formative experience I have as an Angelino starts in Pacific Palisades. I'm born into the house in the Huntington Palisades, right in the middle of the village that burnt down, and I had to, tell that story live on the air, over days and days and days and days. And I have never actually experienced anything quite like doing this. Um, Watching your childhood memories all carbonized in real time. So many things about the Palisades, the grocery stores, the religious houses of worship, the doctor's offices, the restaurants, the public park, the library. I mean, everything I knew. I'd just been there with my sister, one of my sisters who had a baby days before to hang out the park, carbonized before my eyes. And how do you process that in real time? And I think, especially while you're reporting live on national television, and the answer is, I now understand you don't. I couldn't. I didn't. And that's why I jumped into this project, both to reconnect myself to the Palisades and what I couldn't process when I was there, but also to dig deeper on all these questions. Is it going to happen again? Why did it happen? Who's to blame? Um, when are we going to experience this again? And the answer is soon.
Palisades, I did not know. It's funny, before this whole thing, I didn't, the two areas that were hardest hit, there was a Palisades fire in Pacific Palisades and the Eaton fire in Altadena. And I'm not a Los Angeles person by any means. I've been there probably a dozen times in my life. I'm a real dyed in the wool New Yorker. I can tell you how to get almost from any neighbor to any neighborhood on the subway. And I do not have that command of Los Angeles. And one of the things that I found really interesting amidst the horror and the awful human toll was just learning about these two communities, Altadena and Pacific Palisades, both because they're very different in many ways, but also just seem to be, I don't know, it's so special to have a neighborhood and a community that feels like a place, like a real place where people have bonds to each other and bonds to the place. And these were very different places, you know, sort of socioeconomically, demographically, but both seem to have incredibly rich community neighborhood fabrics that I got some joy in learning about in the aftermath of this awful destruction.
Community is the exact word I was going to use. Palisades feels like a small town in a big city. And so does Altadena. LA, by the way, is a patchwork of neighborhoods. It's a city made up of so many different little communities. I think on the East Coast we call them towns, but in the LA, it's these distinct little neighborhoods. And actually, I spent probably more time in Altadena in my adult years than I did in the Palisades. I live pretty much equidistant between the two. But like my son Noah's ninth birthday, we had at the Side Pie Pizza place that burnt down in Altadena. I mean, I actually still do an enormous amount of time in both places. And as you said, they couldn't be actually more different. They're united in their sense of community, but Altadena is historically working class, historically much more diverse. It sits in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains. The Palisades is in the foothills of the Santa Monica Mountains, much more affluent, much more white. But both of them are places where people have raised families for generations. And that's part of the devastating nature of this story. You know, what did the costliest wildfire event in American history do? It literally wiped virtually two beautiful and completely different neighborhoods off the map.
Let's talk about why the fire happened first. Just take us through the factors. You sort of unspool this both in real time and then in talking to experts in the book.
Yeah.
But I mean, the first big thing is, and this becomes evident early on, is that like people know about the Santa Ana winds. If you could describe what they are, the winds were just like off the chart, standard of deviation, multiple standards of deviation off, you know, out on the far end of the bell curve winds when this was all happening.
It was crazy. I'm talking to you from South Florida, where you and I have actually reported together during hurricanes.
That's right. Well, that's where we met. We actually met on the Gulf Coast in the middle of Hurricane Irma in a hotel room while we were chasing a storm.
And the first place I came for Irma, and then we got redirected, was Miami, and that's where I am. That's where I am now. The winds that you and I felt during Irma were pretty comparable to the winds that we were feeling from the Santa Ana winds. And I'm not going to say it was 100% unprecedented, but it was definitely nothing I've ever experienced in my lifetime. And most people that are alive in LA had never experienced it in their lifetime. And it was predicted by the meteorologists at the National Weather Service. They issued what was called a particularly dangerous situation warning, saying that these mountain wave winds, the Santa Anas, the hot wind from the Northeast, as Joan Didion, famously wrote about, were going to come up and over both the Santa Monica Mountains and the San Gabriels, push the air down in a way that it doesn't normally do. And if there was going to be any ignition at all, any spark, it was going to be catastrophic. These guys said this. You'll meet in the book Ariel Cohen and Dave Gomberg, the meteorologists. I got so nerdy and dorky for this book. on that granular level, I wanted to go meet people like this. I went to the National Weather Service office in Oxnard, California, and spent a day with them to learn about how they do what they did. They called it.
They
They called
100%
it
call it. You actually print in the book the warning,
the
which
whole
is
warning
which is completely like down to every last detail, completely
about what was
prophetic.
going to happen.
Totally
Yes,
prophetic, yes.
they knew. And so these winds are blowing through. My son Noah, the day I was leaving the house, said, "Hey, Dad, look outside. Look how windy it is." And I didn't think twice. I put on a hat like I'm wearing now. I put on my jean jacket. I walk out the door. I go to the NBC News Bureau, and I'm like looking around when I get there, and it's kind of windy. But I'm like, I don't know. What happened was two things in the Palisades. The action, and we can talk about this later. But what I have since learned is there is never one proximate cause of a fire like this, of the devastation. There are lots of factors that made these two fires, as awful as they were, it's combined to create these great LA fires. Um, but where were the ignitions and why did the ignitions happen? The ignitions happened in the Palisades because of a holdover fire. There was an arson fire, allegedly, federal prosecutors say, called the Lockman fire that was started on January 1st. And my brother actually lives up there. He told me about it at the time. And the fire department had thought, or they said, there's still investigations going on about the mop-up process from this fire, but that it was extinguished or it was contained. And it turns out that underneath the surface of the Santa Monica Mountains, beneath the dirt, beneath the remaining chaparral, the root system of some of the plants, they're not called embers when they're underground, they're called firebrands. They were still smoldering under the ground. There's some video now that's emerged that potentially people saw
Wow.
this. And when the winds hit the Palisades in the mountains, it blew the dirt off the top of the root system, just inches below the ground. It again turned from basically an ember into a flame, and that lit the fire in the Santa Monica Mountains. It very, very quickly got out of hand.
I gotta say, I did not know this was possible until I read your book. Like
didn't know either.
that was new to me, that you could, and for a week, that's the other crazy thing. So you've got this
Smoldering.
subterranean smoldering basically in the root system.
Yep. Beneath the surface of the Santa Monica Mountains. And this is like hard packed dirt. And by the way, remember, there was virtually no rain all winter in LA last year. This year has been totally different. It's been
No, it's
dumping and dumping.
130% reservoir level right now.
There's nowhere in California that is experiencing drought conditions for the first time in 25 years. Yes, last year was the opposite. Talk about climate change. The Eaton fire was totally different. The Eaton fire, same wind phenomenon, but we get into all the causes of this, what the fire of the future is made up of, which is what this was. But the Eaton fire was started when dormant giant steel lattice towers that carried high voltage electrical lines that were no longer in use were electrified because of charge from active lines. And however it happened, those sparked and created the fire in Eaton Canyon and the foothills of the San Gabriels, which then sent embers flying into Altadena. So two totally distinct, separate fires, dozens of miles apart, that were equally destructive.
So you got two major conditions here, right? So there's it was extraordinarily dry. It had been an extraordinarily dry winter and extraordinarily windy. And then all you need is some spark, which can happen for, as we saw, different ways, right? There was a fire that federal prosecutors say was set, then it was dormant, then it sparked back to life, the dormant tower getting a charge. But at that point, it's also like the conditions just need a little bit, because the conditions are the thing that are driving it.
And if it didn't happen there, it very well could have happened somewhere else, in some other place. And the nature of the winds, as we talked about, that first night I drove back from the fire, I'll never forget it. I was driving in the car by myself to my house after I cleared Stephanie Rule's show. And it was like we're in the middle of a hurricane. The car was just listing side to side. I was on Santa Monica Boulevard in West LA, and it was like, I have never, ever experienced anything like this. All it would take, as the guys at the National Weather Service said, is one spark, doesn't matter where. And instead of one spark, we got two on two separate sides of the most populous county in America.
So obviously, wildfires in Los Angeles have been going for a long time.
Oh yeah.
You know, everyone could read your Mike Davis and your Joan Didion and various authors. And it's always been the case that Los Angeles is a dry place, and that the way that it's built is in tension with some of the basic climactic factors that exacerbate risk. People like to build on hillsides, and there's, you know, that increases erosion, and you're constantly sort of at this war with a place that is very pleasant place to be, but in some sort of deep, profound sense, like, quote unquote shouldn't have 2 million people sitting in it because
Definitely not.
It doesn't produce enough water for that, right? Like, this is the great, American taming of the desert. You could also read Cadillac Desert for another text to cite. So that's the baseline. Like, we all sort of know this basic thing about the reality of Los Angeles. We've all in journalism covered, or as news consumers watched, wildfires, right?
Mm-hmm.
What made this so destructive, and why were all of the apparatuses at the disposal of local authorities to deal with a fire not enough here to save these two communities?
Just to back up for a second on that note, in the 1960s, the fire that was most destructive and most deadly before the Palisades and the Eaton fires was the Bel Air fire. And the Bel Air fire resulted in the Los Angeles Fire Department creating basically a short movie, a film narrated by a Hollywood actor at the time. And the name of the film back then was Design for Disaster. They said in the 60s, after the Bel Air fire destroyed yet another neighborhood in Los Angeles that took a generation to bring back to what it was basically a warning call, siren's call, as one might say. You guys are living in ways and in places that are insane. We are, all of us. And since the devastating Bel Air fire of 1961, nobody ever went back and changed it. We just kept moving more and more into the so-called wildland urban interface, where we literally live amongst the places that are most prone to burn. We build our homes with materials that are combustible. We have barely any defensible space between us and what the Native Americans, the Tongva, the people who are the original inhabitants of the Los Angeles area, burned on purpose because they respected fire. We try to suppress the fire every way, shape, and form that we possibly can. And so what happened in 2025 is just the supersized version of what happened in the 1960s, and the fire department had warned us about it then. Why now was it so particularly catastrophic? The winds, as we discussed, but there isn't enough. I start the book with a quote by Mike Davis from 1998 from Ecology of Fear, when he's talking about Malibu and his famous chapter, which was a paper before that called "The Case for Letting Malibu Burn."
Yeah,
it was basically, what are we doing? Why are we living like this? These areas are supposed to burn, and that's exactly what's happening. And what Mike Davis said, and I'm paraphrasing exactly the quote, but basically, there is no number of firefighters you can throw at fires that burn in the mountains above Los Angeles and expect to stop at period, full stop. It's just not going to happen. Everything around us is combustible. And so when you combine these historic or near historic winds with, it doesn't matter how many firefighters, and there will be investigations about, were there pre-positioned enough firefighters in the Palisades or in Altadena? Should the reservoir have been full? Should the tower have been taken down? Should Karen Bass have not been in Ghana? Should Gavin Newsom have had state parks employees clearing brush? All that stuff is part of these investigations that'll happen. But once there was a spark, there was no turning back in these particular conditions. And because the ember cast, the actual embers, that at times I write, it was almost like in a hurricane, they played the part of pelting rain, but they were just flying sideways. One guy told me that he saw houses burn sideways through because of how strong the wind was pushing the embers. The ember cast was miles beyond where the actual fire was. So you could be at a place and there was no fire for miles, but then 2 miles down the road, a whole community, a whole neighborhood, a whole street will burn. Particularly in Altadena, there's a lot of that. And so those are the conditions that made it ripe for this to happen. And on top of it, we live on top of each other. And so while the Palisades is bigger houses, Altadena is houses tightly packed on tightly planned streets. And the fire just jumped from one building to the next building to the next building. Cars to houses to you name it.
Yeah, I mean, what I got from my takeaway here, and I don't want this to be defeatist, is that, like, it almost felt like it's like this is gonna happen. Like the die are loaded in such a way that you're gonna get really bad conditions at some point. And these were basically worst case scenario conditions, the
Yes.
dryness and the wind. And once that goes, the amount of actual human intervention that's possible is already pretty limited. Is that a fair assessment?
To use a technical term, you're fucked, basically. Seriously, if these conditions develop, relative humidity being as low as it was, fuel moisture being as low as it was, drought conditions being as prominent as they were, combined with the wind, a spark is your worst nightmare. And there was almost, again, there are people out there who are saying you could have had a firefighter mop. There could have been a better mop up of the Lockman fire. And if there was no smoldering, there'd be no fire. That's obvious.
Yeah.
But any spark anywhere would have created this fire.
One interesting thing I learned both in the coverage from it and in reading your book is about that ember and the sort of HVAC systems of these homes and how it, there's the pictures of the homes that are like entirely enclosed, that didn't burn down. And the reason was because it's the embers that are getting through the house to outdoor interface, wherever it is, vents or whatever. Yep. That's lighting these houses on fire, which is why you get those crazy photos of the one house that didn't burn, because it's totally self-contained and never sucked an ember inside.
It is really unbelievable. Some of the other things that people have pointed out to me is homes with tile roofs, terracotta tile roofs. There's a lot of those in LA, Spanish style houses. Not saying none of them burned. But I guess embers had a harder time finding their way in. There's all kinds of conversations about planning and design and I can't tell you how many people I've heard from in the wake of the fire and while writing the book about talking about design for homes that can be safer, never safe 100% in fires like this. But yeah, you'll go down certain streets. McNally Avenue is one great example. Is the main street I profile in Altadena because it's the street that I interviewed Newsom on when I interviewed him on Meet the Press, and I wanted to go back and spend time with the families on that street. There was one house on the whole block that survived. And why? I don't know. They don't know. Could it be the materials? Could it be the way that the house was designed? It really is remarkable. My synagogue in the Palisades, the church across the way from it burned. Houses on the other side of the street burned. This particular building, for some reason, did not burn down. And they believe it was in the design of the synagogue when they built it all those years ago.
When the fire was happening, there was so much chaos and so much frustration about the response.
Mm-hmm.
Take us through that period of uncertainty, the role that disinformation played,
yes,
the exacerbating happening from the incoming president, the president-elect. What did that create in terms of the experience of the fire and covering the fire?
Another type of conflagration, excuse the expression. When all this went down, I thought I was experiencing like a time machine trip into my past, and then I was watching just my childhood vanish in the flames. But when I went to Washington and sat down with a senior emergency management official after the fire, around the White House Correspondents' Dinner time last year, he said to me, I was taking notes on he had been there, he had been to every mass casualty fire federally declared in the last 5 years, and he said to me, give me your notebook, I want to show you something. And he wrote an X on the notebook, and on the 4 different corners of the X, he said, what you experienced was not a trip to your past, but the fire of the future. And I said, well, what is the fire of the future? He said, check this out. Global climate emergency, he wrote on one corner. Changes in the way we live. 1,000 electric car batteries exploded during the fire. It's why some firefighters, Nick Schuler in particular in the book from CAL FIRE, the state firefighting agency, said to me, he thinks he's going to get cancer or could get cancer because of the stuff that they were all breathing in while they were fighting the flames. Infrastructure, I already talked about that. Palisades Reservoir, the towers in Altadena. But politics of blame and misinformation and disinformation. And he said it cannot be overstated how devastating that was to the psyche of people that were going through the fire and actually for the responders and the response itself. And that's, nobody's absolved in this book. Newsom's not absolved, Bass isn't absolved, or Trump and Musk are not absolved. But particularly the shit that was coming out of Donald Trump and Elon Musk, where it was literally, well, I would say it was pouring rhetorical fuel on the literal flames of the fire. And in particular, during the fires themselves, Trump was president-elect. He wasn't even the president yet.
Yeah.
He was saying, I laugh, but it's not funny, that there was some mystical tap that you could turn on to have water flow from the Pacific Northwest, and it would put the fires out, and Gavin Newsom and Karen Bass are the cause of the fire. And then Elon Musk came out to LA, was hanging out with firefighters, live streaming with these firefighters, pressing them on the conspiracy theories about why the water pressure was so low. And what any civil engineer will tell you, and what many firefighters have told me, is that when you go into your house and turn on every tap in your house, your water pressure is going to go down. And we were flowing in the different municipal water systems in LA City and LA County, the maximum amount of water you could possibly be flowing at any given time. And so it's no surprise that the hydrants started to go dry, because you cannot flow that volume of water, period, full stop, even if the 117 million gallon reservoir in the Palisades was full. And so what Trump was doing, what Musk were doing, was making an already confusing situation. Emergency alerts weren't getting to people like they should. People were turning to Watch Duty app in order to find out where the flames were, or text threads like we were in my family. That's how I found out about the fire. My brother texted me, and I got up and ran out of the LA Bureau to go to the Palisades. There was not enough reliable information from the local government to have the shit pile of mis and disinformation for political purposes coming from the incoming administration at the time.
Just to stay on this for a second, because it drove me really crazy. I just want to give a little context here. So when I went to the Central Valley for the first time, I had a rancher. Like, the first thing that happened when I got there was he took me into a little room where he like gave me the kind of more technically sophisticated, more based in reality version of the Donald Trump magic tap thing, which has to do with how the state and the federal government regulate water flow in the Central Valley, and particularly because sometimes there's this fish called the Delta smelt.
Exactly.
That they want to protect in the Bay Area, and the ranchers have been on a generation-long jihad that they don't get enough water because of these environmentalists want to, baby the little Delta smelt.
Correct.
Now there's a real, like, there's an actual set of reality there and trade-offs about water and stuff. Donald Trump took that and like transformed it in his mind. But that has, by the way, that has literally nothing. I just want to be clear. Literally nothing to do with that. It has literally nothing to do with LA. It has as much to do with LA as it does with Boston's water supply.
Amen. And you know what's even
but
more
am I right? I'm right though.
Yes.
That's what it was, right? It was like that in the game of telephone.
This, I don't know if it was through Kevin McCarthy, who represents Bakersfield up there, or
Devin Nunes.
It
I'm telling you, it's Nunes.
Exactly.
It's because it's such a Central Valley rancher class obsession. Like, they all will tell you this.
They are desperate for water there because it's the most fertile agricultural land in the United States, if not the world. It's the most productive. I mean, it's because
they want the government to give them all the water so they can capture the profits from growing.
And you know what Trump did in the aftermath of this fire, by the way?
Yes, this is what I was going to come to. Yes,
billion gallons of water into the Central Valley, flooding the fields of the people that support him. He didn't even do anything to help them. And
in fact, there is FOIA records of the folks on the ground having to turn things off and to get dams up and running because his order to flood the Central Valley, this is long after the fire is done, would have actually submerged acres and acres of fertile land.
I think he believes that he put the fires out by. I have no idea what he believes. God love anybody who can figure out what he believes, but I think he takes credit for the containment of the fires, and it is so preposterous. It would be hysterical if 31 people hadn't died in these fires, if 400 people, according to the excess mortality data that I've read, potentially died as secondary results of the fire. And if LA was not going to take generations to come back from this, he was. And it's why I include the story about Katie Miller calling me, and I can tell you about that if you want.
Yeah, that was my next.
Why Stephen Miller's wife, why I include the story of Stephen Miller's wife calling me and asking me to check on her in-laws' house in the Palisades, while her own boss and future boss, Musk, because she went to work for Doge, were spreading these batshit conspiracy theories.
Yeah, tell me about that phone call. It's an amazing moment in the book.
I'm standing there getting ready to go on a special report with Lester Holt on the second morning after the fires. And I've just driven through my childhood neighborhood and everything is gone. And my phone rings and I look down and it says Katie Waldman. And well, Katie Waldman, that's her old name. She was the junior most press deputy at the Department of Homeland Security when I covered family separation. She let me into the facilities. I'm grateful to her for that because I wouldn't have been able to cover those facilities on that day that I talked to you. After I wrote Separated, and I included some stuff that she said to me and Katie Tur at a dinner we had in Washington about basically how the policy didn't affect her, how she believes that, why is there a little Havana? We should all be assimilating. She's from here in South Florida. Some stuff that didn't play well, let's just say, to the general public about her. She cut off communication. I hadn't heard from her in years. She didn't like the book. Fair to say, no problem. But when the phone rang and I saw it was her, and I pick up and she said, "Hi, it's Katie Miller." I'm thinking to myself, what's going on? I said, "Katie, I'm about to go on a special report. I got to call you back." Okay. She texts me before I could call her back, and she said, "Here's an address." She sent an address. She said, "This is Stephen's parents' house. You're the only person we know who's in the Palisades. Can you go take a look?" And I'm thinking to myself, am I really being asked to go to Stephen Miller's parents' house right now? But I was. And just like I did for my brother, and just like I did for the kid I drove in high school carpool, I was like, sure, I'll go check it out.
I do the same thing.
And I did. And the Miller's house had burned, and I felt awful, 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 awful for them. I took a picture. I sent her a picture. I said, the Palisades are stronger than politics. I sent a heart emoji. And within minutes is when I noticed these tweets by Trump, Truth Socials by Trump, as I said, pouring rhetorical fuel on the flames of the fire, hurting residents all across Los Angeles, including Stephen Miller's parents, her very own in-laws. And when I asked her if there was anything the president-elect would want to say about any of this, she basically sent me the message back that, like, I didn't call you for any other reason than to get this information from my family. And that was it. And that is, the story to me is emblematic of the moment that we are living in. Look at Argentina right now. There's a huge wildfire burning in Argentina. And there are conspiracy theories going around Argentina about the Jews starting the wildfires in Argentina.
Matt Gaetz has been on. Have you seen this?
No.
Gaetz is doing it on his show. That the Jews have started this so they can start a new Israel in the Western Hemisphere by burning the land. No, real. I mean, it's not real. I'm saying people are actually, yes.
But so anyway, I thought about, should I include the Katie Miller story? It was so personal. I really do truly feel awful for her in-laws. I don't know them.
Yeah.
But I know Stephen and I know Katie. And I thought they're public figures. And they're working for people who are making life harder in Los Angeles in the wake of these fires. Why wouldn't I include the story?
Conspiracy theories. Oh, I mean, this is, and I've studied disasters and written about them. And I remember the Great Chicago Fire. A lot of the stuff is, we think a lot of it's like social media or algorithms, but a lot of, the rumors about looting, all this stuff is like, go back and read about the Chicago Fire or go back and read about the San Francisco earthquake. You get a lot of this similar stuff. You also get, an incredible acts of solidarity, mutual aid. Rebecca Solnit's great book, A Paradise Built in Hell, is about some of this, and I recommend people read that or listen to the podcast I did with her during COVID. But I want to stay on the water pressure for a second, just because that was such a understandable source of rage and frustration for everyone. And one of the things I thought about is I learned from this episode that San Francisco has two hydrant systems in San Francisco. There's a regular one, and then there's a special high pressure water system. And the high pressure water system was created after the San Francisco earthquake. And the reason it was created was because the exact same thing happened. The thing that took out all of San Francisco in the great earthquake in 1906, I guess it wasn't the earthquake. It was the fires created by the earthquake that created the mass destruction. And of course, exact same problem, right? If you've got everything on fire, you're never going to have enough water pressure. And so what they did was they created a separate high pressure water system that's never used, essentially, right? That's like a break glass thing, but they had to put in these special hydrants, all the piping, the new hydrants, and a special high capacity reservoir to power it in response to this. And when I read about that, I thought about A, what the rebuilding looks like for this fire, and B, like the kinds of politics or planning or culture at the highest levels that could produce something like that now. Like, we're going to spend a ton of money and rip up a bunch of streets and do a lot of work to put in this thing that is for a 1 in 100-year event, say.
Yes.
Because when we're going to need it, we're really going to need it. And so I think that brings me to this question of like what the rebuild looks like.
Yeah.
And given like, first of all, how is it going a year later is the first question. But then the next question up the scale is like, how do you rebuild in a smart way that isn't going to lead to this just happening again like the Bel Air fire did in the 1960s?
I worry that we're too far gone, and obviously the insurance marketplace does too. I'm not saying I'm a fan of the insurance marketplace, but there's a reason that they threw a bunch of people off of fire insurance before these fires, why premiums are going up, and why people that study this stuff say the idea of making a place like LA insurable may never actually be an idea that could be based in reality because we live in the wildland urban interface. I'm just thinking about South Florida too. What does resilience actually look like in places like this? Are you going to raise up Miami 2 or 3 feet? What would that cost in order to actually to do that? Are we?
And
gonna,
you could raise it 3 feet, and then you can get a 1 in 1,000-year event that comes in at 5 feet.
That's exactly right.
mean, you know what I mean?
That's exactly right. And we could have a worse fire in Los Angeles. We always thought that the big one in LA, we would train in school, in elementary school, like get under the table for the big one, the earthquake. But it turns out that the big one was the fire, and there will be another big one like this. And I always say, like, part of the deal in these big events and covering them is that they give you like an X-ray vision to see the problems that lie beneath the surface. And family separation, I learned about how it was a bipartisan system that led to ultimately what Donald Trump was able to do over decades and decades, based in uh, deterrence and punishment and criminalizing immigrants. Here, it just made me think about, again, the things that make LA great are also part of the things that make it uniquely vulnerable. And number one here, affordability is a crisis all across the country, but particularly in Los Angeles. We live in the most unaffordable city in the most unaffordable state in the union. People cannot afford to get back in these houses in the rebuilding process. 40% of the lots, on average, I think 44% in Altadena, are being sold to corporate investors, according to one study that I saw. Yeah, people can't afford to come back. And so when it comes to the rebuilding, that's part of the problem, the slow pace of the rebuilding effort. 16,000 structures were destroyed. I think maybe 4,000 have permits. I think 10 or 12 houses have been rebuilt so far.
Wow.
Tariffs have made construction materials more expensive. And then perhaps the fissure, I think, in LA that is most pronounced is that we are the undocumented capital of America. We have 10% of our population, 1 million people, are undocumented. 40% of the construction industry in California, according to Gavin Newsom, is undocumented. And who are the primary targets of the ICE raids that are going on around the country? And what is the primary location? It ain't the worst of the worst. I'm sorry to surprise you. It's day laborers in Home Depot parking lots who are standing around hoping to get hired to be engaged on the recovery construction projects from the Palisades to Altadena. It has created a chill factor in Los Angeles that has kept the workers that are desperately needed to be a part of the recovery away from the recovery itself. And I know you know them too. 2 days ago, I was with Pablo Alvarado from the National Day Laborers Organizing Network. And he was just saying to me, I got guys being taken off the streets every day. He came to my book reception party in Altadena on Monday night. And he said, I'm sorry I'm late. 7 guys were just taken. And I had to deal with that. And that's happening every day in LA. Do you think that the raids are slowing down in LA because they're ramping up in Minneapolis or in Charlotte or in Chicago? You're wrong. We got more people being taken now than were being taken at the height of this in June. And so all of these different factors in the wake of a big mass casualty event like this become so glaringly obvious. Big policy conversations about topics that have nothing to do with actual fire that are making the recovery itself, I think, exponentially more difficult and slowing it down.
There's also, just to me, like, there's a bunch of fundamental trade-offs and tensions, and you write about some of this in the book, that aren't, like, there just is a tension, for instance, between rebuilding quickly and making sure that, like, you've passed environmental review and you're not, like, you don't have a completely toxic soil situation. Like, those two things just are in tension, right? And there's also a tension between, like, rebuilding quickly in a way that the lot goes to the highest bidder who has the most resources to rebuild, as opposed to getting people back in their own neighborhood who are less capitalized. And so it's going to take them longer to like, there's a bunch of competing imperatives here that there's no just magic win-win solution, it seems to me, to pull out of the hat.
There are so many micro stories here too. Jet Propulsion Laboratory at Caltech is in La Cañada Flint Ridge, also in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains. I think, oh, I know hundreds of Caltech employees, including Kate Hennigan, who you'll meet in the book. She lived on McNally Avenue,
Yep.
lost their homes in the fire. This is happening as the Earth Science program at NASA is on the chopping block during the Trump administration. They flew with a mission called FireSense in Florida and Georgia in the wake of the fires to study what the firefighters of the future are to fight the fire of the future. And they use imaging spectrometry to map from the sky using lasers fires below from airplanes to better help position the assets on the ground. Those programs are all at risk of being canceled or cut or killed under the Trump administration. And these are people who are trying to rebuild their houses in some cases at the same time. And that story, by the way, is true in so many federal departments, acutely making the LA wildfire recovery more difficult, but also making recovery from future fires more difficult. Firing meteorologists at the National Weather Service, firing health and safety people at NIOSH that study firefighter deaths and fatalities in the wake of it, the exodus from FEMA, the cancellation of the $1 billion disaster registry at NOAA, which has tracked every major, I did this story on your show.
Yeah.
Every major $1 billion disaster in the last 40 years. And because they use the words climate, the program is now gone. The federal government no longer keeps records, and we will never know the cost of the Great Los Angeles fires, according to the federal government, because Adam Smith, the lead researcher, left the program. All of these things affects the insurance markets directly. It's how many of the insurance companies would make their plans to set the premiums for houses in disaster zones. And so all of this stuff is affecting the recovery, and the administration's policies are making it much more difficult.
The insurance angle to me is pretty important here, just to stay on that for a second, because you're also in South Florida where, insurance is an interesting thing, particularly home insurance. I think about this a lot, like the totemic significance of gas prices as a political indicator. And the big reason for that is that it's the one price that's plastered up that everyone sees all the time and interacts with all the time. I mean,
right.
It's literally the only price that is up in big numbers as you drive around, and you're constantly paying it, and it goes up and down. You're like, oh, it's high. It's lower. For a lot of people who have a mortgage, the home insurance might even be rolled into a mortgage payment so that you're not even seeing it as a distinct thing. So there's a way in which it can be an under the radar thing, and also in the general profile of home ownership, which can be expensive, it tends to be a relatively small part of the pie. It's true for electricity bills as well, for people that make a certain amount of income. Not true for poor people, but upper middle class people, relatively small part of the pie. Both of those things are growing. And particularly insurance, it's particularly growing in places like Florida, it's growing in Texas, and it's growing in California. Like this idea, I mean, I know people that have all the money in the world in California and just can't get insurance, right? It's not even like there's not a market clearing price for it. They have to go to, and now the state has basically set up this backstop fund. Florida's going to do this.
My brother has, by the way, in California, and it's just not enough money. It isn't enough money to pay for the rebuilding, period.
Well, the obvious way this is all pointing is like enormous public bailouts after disaster. I mean, like what is going to happen is in Florida and California, there will be a public backstop to the insurance because they can't price the risk affordably in the private market. And then when big things happen, the government will just pay for it. Now, I'm fine with that because the government's our safety net. But what we've seen in things like the National Flood Insurance Program is that you produce incredibly perverse incentives. Like, because you're basically artificially cheapening building in the most prone places, right, lowering the cost of it, so because the price isn't reflected. And then when disaster happens, then it's like, the government writes a check to Trent Lott, who's got a big house on the Gulf during Hurricane Katrina, which is a real thing that happened.
This is the way that it's going. And I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not a surprise. I'm no fan of insurance companies, but it's no surprise that the insurance companies don't want to insure anymore because I think that the risk of catastrophe is far too great for them to make a profit ultimately if something like this were to happen again.
How have the people you've covered, how are they doing a year later? Like, just if you want to start with your community and also talk about Altadena, because I know in Altadena there's a specific set of concerns about a community that was working class and was diverse and has an incredible Latino and African American traditions and roots there are being displaced.
Yes.
So I guess start with Palisades and maybe then talk about Altadena.
It's this book is a book about, it reads like a sci-fi thriller, but it's a real lived experience that we all had in LA as Angelinos, and I think that everyone will experience at some point soon. It's a book about people as much as it is about politics and as it is about the climate. And I just think of all the people that I met. I needed this book so badly for myself because it was such a traumatizing thing that I think I probably still have some form of, if not diagnosable PTSD, like this was a collective trauma that we
Yeah.
all experienced together. And the names of the people come back to me instantly. Albino Fuentes is one of them, a worker in Cafe Vita in the Palisades, a restaurant that I would frequent. Before that, he worked at Mort's Deli. So I've known him for 35 years. He came to my writer's block event in LA the other night. And it makes you think about the people who don't lay their heads in these communities at night, but go and work in these communities. He had to find a job, and he did. But so many people like him are having trouble finding work that would come into places like the Palisades and Altadena for work. The firefighters, Eric Mendoza, who
He's a
were
great
in Manhattan-
character in the book. Yeah.
Fire Station 69. The dude laid on his stomach in a prone position on concrete because it was so hot that it was the only place he could fight a fire and not burn to death alive. Open his hose to 2.5 inches, to go full flow as much as he could to save any structure that he could. He raced home on the Friday after the fire started, crossed the threshold of his house, couldn't breathe, collapsed, and his wife and his daughter had to take him to urgent care to get steroids and oxygen. And him and other firefighters, as Hannah Dreyer has reported so wonderfully for the New York Times, will be dealing with the effects of breathing in these changes in the way we live in America's new age of disaster for the rest of his life. These firefighters have, I'm not saying him in particular, but higher levels of lead and mercury in their blood in the tests in the wake of the fire. There's Tim Larson from the fire department. In Altadena, I already mentioned Kate Hennigan, who I think about all the time, and her colleagues at JPL and what they're going through. Herb and Lloyda Wilson, 36 years at UPS. They met and married and lived on McNally next to Kate Hennigan around down the street. They've got nothing. And they have moved 10 times since
Ugh.
the fire. That's the reality of people who are having a hard time finding a place to stay and afford. 10 times in the wake of the fire. And then there are all of these people, like I mentioned, all these people that work in the government, locally and nationally, who may not have lost homes themselves, but are looking at the programs that the federal government uses to take care of these places that I think about on a regular basis. So, when I think about how is it going, I think it's this weird cognitive dissonance. It's these neighborhoods are no longer there. You drive through them, and it is one big open construction site on two separate sides of LA. But in a way, the humanity that is as always happens in these disasters, not to be cheesy about it, because now I've experienced it, I'm not just covering it. It really is a unifying, amazing thing. And I think that no level of coming together is going to stop one of these things from happening again. But the reckoning that I've been able to have by being in community with so many people that have gone through it, that's sort of the sick thing about this, is that hundreds of thousands of people evacuated, or it affected directly, and millions of people on the periphery were affected by this. We all went through this collective trauma together in some way. And I think that hopefully, at least, I don't think there's going to be there may be an exodus from LA because of the affordability crisis and the slow pace of rebuilding, but it's not going to be for lack of a love of LA. I think it's sort of brought us together in this way where we all love the city in a way like we did in New York post 9/11. That was my 7th day of school at NYU.
Yeah.
And I'll never not love New York because of what happened on that day and how we were all there together. And I think there's a similar feeling right now in Los Angeles.
One thing that comes through in the book, to me, one of the great gifts of aging is that I think the greatest gift I feel like it's given me is that I'm more able in the moment to appreciate things and just and feel gratitude. Like, if all 3 of my kids aren't sick on a January day,
Yes, exactly.
I'm like, I can be like, this is great. Look at it. If we have like a lovely meal together as a family, and I feel that way about the city. I've always loved New York City, but I feel a deep sense of love and gratitude. And I feel gratitude about the place I live. I feel gratitude for the fact that the Prospect Park exists and that it's, there's all these people that work to maintain it. And I one of the things that comes through here is just like the deep gratitude you feel about the place that made you.
Incredibly.
And I just wonder if you could talk about the perspective it gives you to like when it, it's like when you lose a person in your life, you think about what they meant to you, and then you try to apply that lesson to the relationships you have with the people in your life, right after the funeral and right after the Shiva.
So
You
true.
try to be like, this is incredible that we're here together. And obviously it's hard to apply that lesson, but it seems to me like if there's some part to take away for you about how you feel about Los Angeles, how you feel about the amazing neighborhood you got to call home growing up.
Yeah, the book became a love letter to LA. And this event taught me a lot about myself and like emotional intimacy, and slowing down. Um, I think I have the greatest job in the world, but we're also always, all of us, going a billion miles an hour. And this allowed me to slow down and look around and reconnect with my city and my childhood neighborhood, and even my own family, my immediate family, my parents, who in 1986 rebuilt the Palisades Park because my dad hit his head on the playground there and cut his head open and said, we're going to live here forever. My 3-year-old boy, Jacob, deserves a place where we can all call home for our lifetime. And my siblings, all 5 of us, and my wife, Nicole, and my kids, like, we all are in different relation to each other today than we were, I can say it confidently, than we were when the firestorm happened. And I wish this experience on nobody, but there is some version of the story that I kind of wish on everybody, that obviously not the death of the 31 people, or anybody to lose a home, but the ability to find connection in the wake of a collective trauma like this is something that I think has changed me forever. I got a lot more gray hair now than I did in January 2025. Um, but I love where I'm at and where the city's at, and I still grieve. This is a grieving process. Grief will stay with you forever. I've learned a lot about. I mean, I've had death in my life, but this is a different form of death and a different form of grieving. This will be with me and all of us for a long time. Maybe never go away, but we will live in relation to it and can grow from it. And I definitely feel like uh, it's it's changed me for in a way that I'm grateful for.
Jacob Soboroff is the MS Now senior political and national reporter, New York Times bestselling author of Firestorm, The Great Los Angeles Fires and America's New Age of Disaster. It's a really great read, a fast read, really well done. Jacob, thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate you, man.